Hello, fellow foodies. Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in this week. I've got some exciting news. My book called The Plant Hunter is available for pre-order. It's a book about adventure, scientific discovery, medicine, and so much more. To learn more about the book or order a copy, head to my website at cassandraquave.com. I also have a special offer available now for anyone who places a pre-order. I have book plates that I will personally sign and mail to you, only for US addresses. More info on how to get your personalized book plates to stick into your book when it arrives are available at cassandraquave.com, and that's CASSANDRAQUAVE.com. You can also sign up to my author newsletter to ensure that you don't miss any cool book news and offers. Great, so let's jump into today. I am super excited to dive into our subject. We're going to be talking about cocktails and spirits and sustainability. So it's a great combination. Cheers to that. I'm really excited to have Shanna Farrell as our guest. She's the author of a new book entitled A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirit. Let me back up. She is the author of a new book entitled A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. Shanna is also an interviewer at UC Berkeley's Oral History Center, where she works on a wide variety of projects and specializes in drink, cultural, and environmental history. She's the author of Bay Area Tales, and her writing has appeared in Imbibe magazine, Life and Time, Punch, and the San Francisco Chronicle. She holds master's degrees from both New York University and Columbia University. Welcome to the show, Shanna. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I guess to set up the stage, what can you tell us about what got you interested in these two topics of sustainability and beverages? How do those come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had been in the service industry for about 15 years. I was working as a server in college, and then when I went to grad school, I started bartending in New York City. And so I was doing environmental history. I was kind of, my first master's was interdisciplinary. It was kind of a create your own adventure. And I was studying water pollution and how people were affected in different ways by the Hudson River being a Superfund site. And all the while I was bartending and I was looking at different spirits on the back bar. And there was one distillery who had set up shop along the banks of the Hudson River. And on that was a beautiful bottle. On that, the bottle, it said 100% New York State produced grain. And I was really taken by that because I had never seen anything like that, unless it was agave and there's 100% agave or Blue Weber on tequila. But with whiskey, that wasn't really the case. Often we don't know where those things come from. So for long story short, when I was doing interviews for my research, I ended up interviewing the founding distiller at that place and talked to them about how they had created a direct relationship with farmers. They had kind of cut out the distribution, the packing shed in the middle, and I didn't even know that was possible. And so from there, this whole thing was born about thinking of sourcing ingredients, and then also from the bar side, the water waste, since water pollution was my topic of study, and then also composting. I had worked for the Department of Sanitation in New York City and the recycling division, and we were rolling out a composting program. And so all these things kind of came together, and yeah, here we are.
Great. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is we've seen this emergence of attention to farm to table type cuisine. And when we think of farm to table, it's often restricted to just food. But what about beverages? Is there a pathway for farm to table beverages?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I definitely explore in the book. One thing I started to notice when I moved from New York to the Bay Area was on menus at restaurants, especially ones that were kind of labeled as farm to table, there was always a list of purveyors on the bottom of a menu. You know, where did the produce come from? Where was the meat from? But there was always this disconnect between the drinks on the menu. The same principles didn't apply. And so I started to think about, why does that disconnect exist? And why don't we treat spirits in the same way we do food? And so I started to dig into the topic. And I think one of the big reasons is that alcohol is regulated differently. It's not regulated by the FDA. It's actually regulated by the TTB, which is a more of the Tax and Trade Bureau instead of the Food and Drug Administration. So I think that, yeah, those set up some of the divides there. The alcohol is subject to a list called generally recognized as safe, which is under the FDA. So there is one provision there. But there are things on that list where, you can include red dye number 40, or there can be high fructose corn syrup in that. But because it's regulated by the TTB, you don't have to have a list of ingredients on a bottle like you do on a pack of Skittles or something. So I think that kind of divides that a little bit. There's also the business models that come in. A lot of distilleries who practice eco-friendly methods didn't always want to put that front and center because there was this idea that sustainability and luxury couldn't coexist. And so I think that furthered the divide. And then also I think because it's not like wine where we don't necessarily know where the grain is coming from. It could come from another state, or a distiller might not even know where in the US it's coming from. You can't visit a farm necessarily and say oh, this is where the grain comes from. So I think that the lack of transparency in the food chain is also kind of sets that up. But I do think that the more that people start to ask questions about where things are coming from, or if you're a liquor store or you're a beverage director or something, you could ask a distributor, do you know more about where this place is getting their grain from? And the more that those questions get asked, I think there's more accountability, and then there can be more thought placed on the distiller about oh, we have to be transparent about where things are coming from.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, and this is all about the sense of place for our foods, but I'm also thinking, when we talk about farm to table, we also get into how it's grown. Is it grown organically? Is it grown with certain types of pesticides? But I don't recall seeing much information like that on some of our spirits. I mean, do spirits contain those bits of information?
And no, and I think that goes back to the way it's regulated, because they don't necessarily have to disclose that information. I think we're seeing more and more distillers who are doing that. And especially there's the first in the book, the first chapter focuses on a distillery in Charleston, South Carolina called Highwire. And for one of their bourbons, their Jimmy Red Corn bourbon, they use a landrace heirloom varietal of corn. And that's on the label, but that's the choice that they've made. And I'm finding that more and more distillers, if they're using non-GMO grains, or if it's something like that distillery in New York where it's 100% from one place, they're electing to put that on the label. So yeah, I think that's starting to change a little bit, but that also means that you have to know where it's coming from to put that on there.
Yeah. That's a great point. Well, going back to consumers, what do you think consumers would be surprised about to find in their beverages? Are there any things that would maybe shock us even?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things. So additives are ingredients that have been maybe shipped around the planet, or things like 18-year-old plants that end up in your bottle of mezcal. In terms of additives, I mentioned before red dye number 40, so it's a food coloring, or if you're drinking some type of fruit flavored liqueur, chances are that fruit they're not using the essence of that fruit. They're actually using something that was derived in a lab. So it's a synthetic ingredient, and that doesn't necessarily have to be listed on the bottle because it's on that generally recognized as safe list. And so I think that, you can do for certain brands, if it's a bright red color spirit, it's probably not going to be naturally dyed, though there are some great alternatives that are dyed naturally with a type of beetle. But you can Google what are the ingredients in here, and you can find that, but it's unfortunately the onus is on the consumer to do that. So I think that's kind of surprising to people that those additives can be there. And the high fructose corn syrup and all the things that come along with high fructose corn syrup, that's usually for texture to make a drink thicker. And then I do think when we're thinking about carbon footprint and climate change and the impact that the food system has on our global system, having ingredients for gin, like a botanical that's grown in one part of the world and it's shipped across the world to be used in a product in the middle of the country or something like that. And that can apply to a number of different botanicals. It's maybe not just one, it's like 30 that come from different places. And so I think that the impact there is a lot greater than we think it is. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other one, on a happy note, not just all doom and gloom, something like mezcal, some of those agaves take, 13, 15, 18 years to grow. And so those plants have a long, long life. And I think it's really cool when distillers there are trying to capture the essence of the story of that agave and putting the essence of that into the bottle. And when you're drinking it, you're really getting that sense of place. And so I think that's a fun, surprising one. The plants can be a lot older than we think they are.
That's really cool. Yeah. I want to dig into a couple of the things you mentioned, going back to the corn syrup. So when I think of high fructose corn syrup in cocktails, my mind immediately goes to mixers. Are you saying that they're also used in the spirits themselves, or is it primarily, I mean, where do we find these things? And so where do we know to look out, basically?
Yeah, it is primarily the mixers, the liqueurs. I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's a big thing. But when
Mm-hmm.
you're thinking about cocktails that are often used in there, so one of the ingredients in a Negroni usually has the thickening agent in there.
Mm.
But and it is a lot of the liqueurs. Usually the spirits, with certain types of tequila, if it's not 100% agave, you can add things like corn, you can add things like sugar, you can add a bunch of things. Those are called mixtos. And so that's usually not on the bottle. Usually on the bottle is the 100%. And so those things can go in there and we don't necessarily know. But with other base spirits, it's usually just the grain that goes in there. But it's always good to ask. I mean, some rums do use caramel for flavor coloring, or if there's some brand wants the appearance of age after it's been sitting
Mhm.
around for a couple of years, they will add some coloring to that. So that's something to be aware of as well.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily getting it from aging in a barrel, but from something being added to it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I also wanted to touch on your discussion of gin. I think what's really fascinating about gin, it is such a botanical beverage, and of course, juniper is the core ingredient, right, for flavoring. That, and we have junipers found across the globe. But you mentioned and you touched on these other botanicals. There's lots of different types of gin that are flavored uniquely with different botanicals, and the sustainability of some of these can be quite challenging, especially when they're, if you have a gin situated in a certain place, that place may not be able to support the level of collection, especially of wild plants for that particular flavor. What else have you learned about gin in your research?
Yeah, I think that it's gin's a really interesting one because it has to have the juniper in there to be technically qualified as gin. But
Hmm.
then there's a bunch of other botanicals that can be added. And I think that the thing that I found most interesting is that there are distilleries who can use locally grown botanicals, so they don't have to be reaching
Hmm.
across the globe to get something that they think would be good. This
Hmm.
is the traditional style of gin, and so I have to include this, but really incorporating that sense of place. And then also, if it's local, there can be more of a connection between this distiller and whoever is growing those botanicals, so they know how they're being grown, they know about scale, like are we taxing this too much? If the foraging is part of the scope of what they're doing, they can kind of know, okay, well, we forage this area this time, we're going to go over here. Foraging isn't always sustainable though. I mean, I think it's one of these like hip cool topics in cocktails, is like this is a thing that we foraged, but if everyone is foraging, then
Yeah.
it's going to throw the balance of the ecosystem off. And so I think that these are conversations that distillers are starting to have about what works in this area may not in this area. So I think that's a really cool thing. Another thing, just not it's related to the botanicals, but about the distilling end. The distillery that I feature in the gin and vodka chapter is the Leopold brothers in Colorado, and they practice fractional distilling where they don't throw all the botanicals in the still at once. They distill each botanical to get the maximum flavor out of it, and then they blend it together. And I think that just makes such a bright, rich gin with so much flavor. And they're using local ingredients as well. So you're really getting a sense of Colorado in that bottle. And it's really beautiful. Yeah.
That's great. I'll have to check that one out. Well, this leads in beautifully to my next question, and that's, how are small businesses, everyone from small businesses to bartenders and farmers, helping to pave the way for sustainable spirits?
Yeah, I think in terms of the bar, those are sort of the ambassadors. Those are the people who are really important because they serve as the gateway between the spirits and the consumers.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're making cocktails, they have a really good sense of what will pair well with the spirit. How do we showcase this drink or the spirit in the best drink possible? And so I definitely think that for bartenders, there's a lot of things that they can do. And that's, if they have purchasing power, to be asking the distributors, how is this distillery functioning? What do you know about them? Are they calling themselves green and maybe just throwing up solar panels on the ceiling or on the roof? Or are they thinking about how they're cleaning their stills or where they're sourcing their ingredients? And so the more questions that get asked, first of all, you have more product knowledge, so you can sell that drink to your customers better. But you can also say, you know what, I actually don't want that spirit because it doesn't follow the principles that I'm interested in for my particular bar. And then I also think that they have the power to, if a consumer comes in and maybe they're interested in sustainable spirits, they can have a conversation like, well, we don't actually carry this product, but have you tried this one? And I can make you a drink and this kind of thing. And then in terms of the waste stream, they also have power in that way as well. So, thinking about their water usage or if they're composting, what kind of garnishes they're using, because that's pretty wasteful as well. This is not a super popular opinion, but sometimes I advocate for not using garnishes in drinks. They're really pretty, but if mint is maybe a poor example because it's a weed and it grows in abundance, but if you have a bunch of mint and you're only using one piece because it's the most green, and then you're throwing out the rest, that does contribute to the waste stream. So I think that the bartenders play a really important role. And then in terms of consumers, I think it's just a matter of getting interested in these things and maybe starting to think about spirits in the way they would food. And so if they go to a liquor store, asking the sellers there, like, I'm interested in a locally sourced vodka or whiskey or something like that, and seeing what that liquor store might know about how that thing is made, maybe going home and doing some research on it. And then I think being open-minded to alternatives. So if you're finding that one drink has red food dye number 40 and you'd like to drink something that's been dyed naturally with a beetle, knowing what to ask for. There's a bunch of alternatives out there. So being open-minded to trying it, even though it might not have the same taste, but yeah.
That's great. It's great. Well, I mean, here's a very basic question that, some of our listeners might have, and it is, what really determines whether or not something is sustainable or not? We've talked a lot about local, but what are the kinds of questions that they should be asking of their bartenders or their local liquor stores?
Yeah, so that I think gets a little bit more complicated. And I think with that piece really goes back to the farmers and the way things are being grown. And then having the distillery be interested in sourcing from a place that practices crop rotation, that uses organic practices. I think some people are starting to think about regenerative farming, but it isn't really that big in distilling quite yet because it is such on a smaller scale right now. And a lot of these distilleries need huge scale. Or it's like creating that direct relationship with a farmer. So if you ask for something that's organic, can I have organic grown corn or something like that? The farm might make those changes. I think, knowing how somebody is using water. Is the distiller aware of how much water they're using? Are they not? Maybe is it a B Corp distillery? There is one B Corp distillery that I feature in the book, and I think that they provide a lot of transparency and are very involved in what's going on. And so I think, asking if a consumer knows that this distillery, there's only a handful of B Corp distilleries around the world, but if they're
I'm
asking.
sorry, what is a B Corp
Oh,
distillery?
sorry.
Sorry.
So it's a like a B Corp certified business where the business has to show all of their accountability, whether that's environmental, social. I think there's three tiers that are involved, but it's like a pretty holistic view of what's happening, what's the impact essentially, all ways around of the business. And the B Corp distillery that I feature in the book is Montagna, and they're also in Colorado, and they had to really chart how much of everything they're using, how much water, what's the impact of that, what's the energy that's going out, that kind of thing. And so they have to do reports every year or every few years or something like that. And they can put on their bottles like, we're a certified B Corp. So it's kind of the instead of just saying we're certified organic, it's like the step above that.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That's great. Well, okay, well, this goes into the next question that I had, and that's around scale. So when we talk about kind of smaller boutique production lines versus some of these larger lines that require just a large volume, not only of the botanicals, the grains, but also of water. Can this be done sustainably on a large scale?
I think it can. I think that's the hard question, because a lot of these places that are creating models are doing something on a small scale where they can have direct relationships with a handful of farmers, or they can source things locally. But if you're a huge company that distributes all over the world, it's a lot harder to do, and there are a lot of trade-offs that you have to make. So it's really thinking about how to balance the environment and the production side. Being careful not to over harvest certain ingredients, thinking about the impact that might have on the ecosystem. I think infrastructure is a really big thing. Do you need more space? Do you need more ingredients? Do you need more energy to be running the stills and that kind of thing? Are you running your operation for 12 hours, or is it a 24-hour thing? I think a lot of that comes down to investment, to being able to think about how to create what you're doing on a small scale, and thinking about, if you're going to scale up, like really what's feasible for you. That, I think, yeah, that's the big question. There's one distillery that I talk about in the book as an example of scale, which is Maker's Mark. And that was a really surprising one to me, about how much thought they give to the sustainability side. It's not something that they have been sharing as part of their story, but they have a few people on their team. Their whole job is to protect the watershed, the local environment.
Wow.
They think about the logging and the
Mm-hmm.
deforestation that goes into producing the barrels. And so, to have somebody on staff whose job is to think about that is a really interesting thing. And they also I think they have on their property is a 101-acre watershed, and they own 100 of those acres. So they can be stewards of the land and protect, thinking about not even the next 5 years, but the next 20, the next 50, the next 100. And because they do own that, and they do have like outside investment, they're owned by a large parent company. They have the money and the infrastructure to be able to do that. So, some places don't want to relinquish control and don't want to sell to a larger company. But that also means that it can be harder to start thinking about some of these sustainability issues like water usage, because you're so used to just trying to keep your business afloat. So it's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you bring up some really good points though around scale and scales of economy, but also, other ingredients that go into the making of spirits. I mean, we haven't touched on this much, but I'm thinking about the barrels. There are certain types of wood that have to be used in making different spirits. And um, few years ago, I had a chance to visit a place where they actually repair and they kind of remold these barrels together and are reused in different types of spirits. And that's just a whole other piece to sustainability, I think. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually one that I don't hear people talking about very often. And I think because that really happens in a particular part of the country. I mean, it's a big thing in the South, and it's also a big thing in Europe. But it's not necessarily something, they're not harvesting redwood trees in California to make barrels. So I think because it kind of happens in a small little area, it's interesting. But I do think it's super important because part of the thing that makes bourbon is it has to be new oak. So it's just, you're constantly milling and creating new barrels. It's an interesting kind of sub economy that's come out of that where new barrels that are used are sold to other places that aren't making bourbon in the same way, don't have the same rules that govern the system. So they can be repurposed, but then barrels only have a certain amount of life that they can only be used a certain amount of time before they really start to break down. But I also think the added part to that, and regardless of what spirit you're making, whether it's new oak or old oak or something like that, is how are you cleaning that barrel? What kind of cleaners are you using? Are you trying to use the byproduct of distilling that has like high proof alcohol where you can clean, it's a disinfectant, or are you using something that you're buying from somewhere else to clean? I mean, I think that that's a big part of it too. And that's where a lot of the water usage comes in because of the cleaning process. So
I think I remember with some types of whiskey, I think they even like burn the inside of it, like they char it inside. It's this whole process. It's really interesting. But yeah, I think the key here is that making spirits isn't just about that core grain. I mean, if it's aged, it has to age in something. and and for those that are flavored, like the gins with those different botanicals, there's lots of different ingredients we don't necessarily always think of when it comes to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, the last question I want to ask on behalf of the foodie pharmacology audience is kind of what can they do as consumers to ensure the availability of sustainable spirits wherever they live? Like, do you have any tips to share with them of actions they could take?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, thinking a little bit about like what's your favorite spirit and maybe doing a Google search about what are the ingredients that go into this? How is it made? And then, depending, I think being informed is great. I hate to just put the burden on the consumer, but I would say just to get interested and ask questions and become a little bit more informed so you can decide what your line is. Do you feel strongly enough about this to switch out your favorite product and try something new? I think going into a liquor store and asking those questions can be useful. And the more that people ask for things, the more that they will stock it. I would hesitate to go ask your local bartender, if you're having like a whiskey sour or something, like how is this grain sourced in this well whiskey? I would caution against doing that. I don't know that is going to be something bartenders are familiar with, and then that could be an awkward situation. But if you are finding like, hey, I really love this gin from the Leopold brothers, and that's made in a sustainable way, can you go into your local bar and say, hey, do you guys have any of the Leopold brothers? So instead of asking questions about what they have, ask for something that a spirit that you like.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great. And they can learn about that spirit and others in your new book, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. And where else can I send them for more information on your book and work?
Yeah, my website is Shanna-Farrell. It's my first name last name.com. And then you can also find me on both Twitter and Instagram at Shanna_Farrell for both of those. So it's my first name _ last name.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, Shanna. This was really interesting.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Skype. You can find this episode and all of our others on our website at foodiepharmacology.com or on Apple Podcasts. You can also find the full video versions of this episode and others on the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. And I want to give a big shout out of thanks to our show's producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth for their support of the show. And thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. It's a lot of fun to continue bringing this show to you. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.